1 to 4 family contract, paragraph 15 default. This paragraph is what's referenced throughout the entire paragraph. If a party is in default, reference paragraph 15. What does default mean? So let's go through this. There's two scenarios, one in which the buyer defaults and one in which the seller defaults, right? So if the buyer fails to comply, the buyer's in default and the seller may do things. The seller could sue for specific performance. That means sue the buyer to go through with the purchase, right? Of course, the buyer has to be able to do that, okay? But sue them to complete the purchase. They could also sue for other relief. Seller has moved out and is in a hotel room. They could sue for the cost of the hotel room and the move and the inconvenience. They could sue for mental issues that it's causing distress as well, right? Or B, they could terminate this contract and receive the earnest money as liquidated damages. Okay. This is what most commonly happens. Buyer's in default, contract's no longer valid, it's terminated, and the earnest money will be released to the seller. Okay. When the earnest money is released to the seller, it would release both parties from the contract, meaning no further, they can't sue after that if they receive the earnest money. Very similar to what if the seller fails. If the seller fails to comply with the contract, the seller will be in default. The buyer has the opportunity to enforce specific performance, which is sue the seller in order to get the seller to sell the property to the buyer or seek other relief as provided by law. Again, the buyer has sold their house, they're living in a hotel room, they had travel expenses, they could sue for all those things and mental anxiety or stress or anything like that. Now, what commonly happens is paragraph B, where the buyer will terminate the contract and receive the earnest money and release all parties from the contract. So if the seller's in default, that's typically what happens. In the residential world, we rarely see people sue each other. It's typically earnest money being released. One of the things that happens here is sometimes the seller's reluctant to release the earnest money to the buyer. It's your job to make sure you explain that to them and let them know if the buyer has many ways that they can terminate the contract. If it's within the contract and they terminate, make sure the seller understands here's where the provision in the contract in which they can terminate. Title companies typically won't release earnest money unless a release of earnest money form is signed. Okay. So let's go through the process of what would happen if a termination was going to happen. So the buyer wants to terminate the contract. Or there's default and they're going to terminate the contract and release the earnest money. So what would happen there is this form, the release of earnest money would have to be filled out, right? So this is concerning the property. The underside direct the escrow agent, Old Republic Title, Frontier, First American Title, whoever it is. That's the escrow agent, not a person. It's the company. The amount of the earnest money and to which party. If the buyer's receiving the earnest money back, the earnest money would go here and it would go back to the buyer. Your buyer can be released to one person or both parties on the contract. That's up to your buyer. If it's going to the seller, if the buyer is in default and the seller wants the earnest money, then again, the earnest money would go here and it would go to the party. The reason there's several lines on here, sometimes divorce situation, seller's going to get the money. That earnest money would be split, typically half and half, one going to one party and half going to the other party. Sometimes the parties agree to split the earnest money where the buyer gets half of the earnest money and the seller gets half of the earnest money. However, y'all agree to split up that earnest money, this is where it's going to go. This is the form that the title company is going to want before they release earnest money. Now, you might say, but in the contract, it says that the terminate the contract and receive earnest money. So it says right there in the contract if they're in default. But we have to remember that title companies are not attorneys, and title companies have been sued over earnest money. So now the title company stance is we have the money. In order to release it, we need agreement of the parties. And this is how they get agreement to the parties. If there's not agreement, then the title company won't release it. Then there's demands that have to be made in another process and maybe small claims court. Okay. If nobody claims it, it'll go back to the state at some point. Okay. but this is the form we typically use. It's going to be a complicated situation the first time you do it. Go see your broker, come see me, and make sure this is filled out correctly. Okay? Complicated? Get help.